the details that we actually know are about 3:48 a.m. There's a car that pulls up with presumably a driver.
Yep.
And a guy jumps out of it, runs into the Palais Royale, or actually the Palace Cafe specifically. Drops some bombs and leaves.
Wild.
It's an enormous explosion that's felt as far away as Mishawaka.
Wow.
There's a night watchman working somewhere in Mishawaka who reports that it felt like an earthquake in Mishawaka.
You heard that there. That is Aaron Helman, local author and historian, talking about the sheer power of the blast from a 1935 bombing at the Palais Royale building at the corner of Michigan and Colfax in downtown South Bend. More of that later, but first, thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. My name is Matt Emery, and I'm a local history nerd. My main mission in this podcast, as well as other Round the Bend material, is to create engaging content that shares how intertwined the South Bend and Mishawaka area's past is to our present. I interview local leaders, business owners, and community members to help tell their stories, because their stories help tell the story of South Bend and Mishawaka. Before we get to the interview, I just have a few simple favors. One is to be sure that you hit the download, like, or subscribe button on whatever podcast app that you listen to us on. Another favor is to follow us on social media, at Round the Bend Pod, or at Round the Bend 574 on Twitter, Round the Bend Now and Then on Facebook, and now on YouTube, where I'm starting to dabble in some visual content as well. I have a few new videos that include some cool historical pictures, maps, newspaper articles, and narration by yours truly. All of those links are in the show notes as well. My last favor is to please just pass on the good word about the content. Now, let's dive into another interview that helps tell the story of South Bend and Mishawaka. In this episode, I meet with local author and historian Aaron Helman. I wanted to talk to him specifically about one of the chapters in one of his newer books about our local history, Ride the Jackrabbit. He wrote a chapter about a 1935 gangland-style bombing that took place right in the heart of downtown South Bend. At the corner of Michigan and Colfax at the Palace Cafe, which is the ground floor of the Palais Royale building. For a reference point, Fat Bird Restaurant is currently in the same space where the Palace Cafe was at. I start the episode out by asking him a little bit about himself and how he got into local history and what made him decide to publish books about it. Then, our listeners will learn about the wild 1935 bombing story that seems like it should have happened in the Chicago gangland era of Al Capone. But nope. It happened right here in good old downtown South Bend. And folks, as you'll learn, this bombing was a big deal. It dominated the local news for months and created quite the intrigue from local citizens. And as I learned from Aaron, the South Bend police still officially consider the bombing an open and unsolved case. So sit back and have a blast as you'll explode with intrigue when you learn all about that next during my interview with local author and historian Aaron Helman. Well, hey, Aaron, thank you for joining us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you went to high school and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so my name's Aaron Helman.
Mm-hmm.
I am a 2002 graduate of LaSalle High School. And
wait a minute, hold on. Is that the last graduating class, or was 03?
No, that's the last graduating class.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what, for a long time, that's what I was most famous for, probably, was being the last graduating class at LaSalle High School. But I'm born and bred South Bend, been here my whole life, and have worked in nonprofits in the area forever.
Yeah.
And during COVID, I ended up writing my first local history book.
Okay.
It's called An Incomplete History of St. Joseph County. And then just this past September, released Ride the Jackrabbit, more of the people, places, and events that make Michiana fascinating.
And I'm going to tell you, I haven't read the first one. I've read almost every story in here. I love it. I love the way that kind of have a little sense of humor with it. It's engaging. It's not dry at all. And you can really hear a voice. You can hear your voice in it. And so that's definitely a good one.
Yeah, I had a friend tell me the problem with most history books is that they're written by historians. And so a lot of people don't like it. And I'm indebted to historians who wrote boring books because I went through a lot of those to do the research for this. But then when I wrote it, I said, I don't want to write a history. My first book was called An Incomplete History for a reason. I wasn't trying to write a history book. I was trying to write a book of stories that people would want to read and make them want to learn more.
Folks, I highly encourage anyone who is interested in our local history to check out his books. He has 2 of them focused on South Bend, Mishawaka, and St. Joe County history. Ride the Jackrabbit, and as he mentioned, The Incomplete History of St. Joseph County. His writing style is very informative, engaging, and what I love about it is he sprinkles in a sense of humor throughout. He also has a new children's book coming out as well on the Southernmost Bend, a beginning history of South Bend. The trailer for that book shows some neat examples of the text and illustrations that I must say looks phenomenal. I put the link to his website in the show notes, so be sure to support Aaron and his books. And as I'm reading this is kind of like what I'm doing with the podcast, just different mediums. I mean, just smaller stories in smaller episodes, or in your case, chapters. It's evergreen. I mean, you can read it won't change, you know what I'm saying? It's not like it's current events, so I can read chapter 28 first and then jump to 1 or something. Same with the podcast. You can listen to episode 18 and then episode 2, and so it's good, definitely. Hey, how did you get into local history and just the history of our area?
That's a great question. So it must have been 2020. I think it was during COVID.
Okay.
Very beginning of COVID. When when the library kind of first opened. I remember there were no chairs. You couldn't sit, but you could go find a book. And so I found this book called The Bone and the Sinew of the Land. And I picked it up because it had a great title. I mean, that's why I picked up that book.
Yeah.
And I read through it, and it was about the experience of African-American pioneers moving into the West when Indiana, Illinois, Michigan was the West.
Okay.
Yeah. And so there was a map that had all the known African-American settlements. And there was one dot in St. Joseph County. It's down by Potato Creek. A place called the Huggart Settlement.
Huh. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it in my life. Even though, like I said, I grew up here, went to school here. Every February had African-American history.
Right.
Never learned that somehow.
No, right.
And so again, it was COVID. We couldn't do anything.
Correct.
But one thing I could do was ride my bike. So I was riding my bike everywhere.
Okay.
And one day I decided
to go down there.
Yeah. Rode my bike down to the Huggart Settlement. There's a historical marker off of Highway 4. And you'd never see it in a car because it's set back. You're probably doing 60
and you're going
miles.
60 whizzing. Yeah. Okay.
But I went down there, checked it out, and I thought, wow, this is fascinating stuff. I wonder if there's more fascinating stuff.
Yeah,
and I found enough to write 2 books about it.
That's insane. Speaking of writing the book, did you look for stories that maybe nobody else might not have known about, like kind of not as much Studebaker and Oliver, or stories that you wanted to learn more about? Or how did you pick the stories for the books?
So the first book, I really did try to do a sketch of each town in the county.
Okay.
So South Bend, Walkerton, North Liberty. And then people ask me, when's the sequel coming out? And I would be like, I don't know if I'm going to write a sequel.
But it's not COVID again.
Yeah. After I wrote that first book, I started getting emails from people, or I'd meet people at events, and they'd say, hey, great book, but you should have talked about Playland Park. Or, hey, did you know about this thing that happened? And I would just start writing these down.
Yep.
I got to look into that. And after I did enough of that, I had a second book's worth of material.
That's the same thing that has happened with this podcast. I frequently get people emailing or messaging about some possible episode ideas. Some of our more popular episodes have been from random people that I don't even know, reaching out and suggesting that I interview somebody to help tell a certain story. So folks, keep the ideas coming. If you know of anyone who would be willing to come on the show to help tell a story from our past, let me know. And so your natural curiosity also, since you didn't know a lot about this stuff, you're learning as you go too.
Yeah. And I say to people all the time, like, everything's fascinating if you're curious enough.
Yeah. Yep.
So you can go down to Walkerton, and they have like a fantastic local history section in Walkerton, Indiana.
Yeah.
And if you're curious enough, like, Walkerton becomes fascinating.
If you could meet anybody from Michiana's past and hang out with them for a day, who would that be?
Gosh, that's a phenomenal question. So, like, Skylar Colfax would be a fascinating one. I would love to know what went on there, but I think I'd actually go with Lathrop Taylor. So he's one of the two co-founders of South Bend, often credited that way. But the one that we hear the least about. But whereas, like, Alexis Coquillard has a kind of a bigger name in history, he died early.
Taylor did?
No, Coquillard died
did because
early.
He fell. And,
he fell and hit his head. So, but Taylor was around a lot longer. And he, more than Coquillard, got to see this place go from like a trading post into the beginnings of what would become a city. And I would love to hear something about that.
That would be neat, seeing it go. Yeah, literally seeing it from just a trading post to industry forming and all that stuff. So, man, is there something in our area's past that you're kind of looking to learn more about right now? Or, I don't know?
Always looking to learn.
Just always.
And it always seems to find me. But like I said, as long as you're curious, everything's fascinating.
Yeah, that's true.
And so I am particularly fascinated right now with the year 1940 in the history of South Bend, which might be like, that's kind of, Studebaker hasn't really started its decline yet. It's pretty close to like peak population of South Bend.
Yeah. Pre-World War II, end of Great Depression.
Yeah. So like Babe Ruth comes in 1940. The Gipper movie premieres in 1940 at theaters throughout South Bend.
Absolutely.
And there's a phenomenal,
well received.
phenomenal picture in this book of Michigan Street during the premiere. Absolutely packed. I mean, tens of thousands of people. It's I would just love to see South Bend like at that height.
I know. Up and down Michigan Street at that time. Oh. All right, we will get into the bombing of the palace.
One of my favorites.
One of your favorites. And before we dive into that, old newspapers in general, you talk about throughout the book. It's one of the main. Actually, for my research, it's pretty much the only way I research, because it's at my fingertips at any time, like newspapers.com and stuff. We now think, we now, you can hop on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever, and we're just inundated with drama, with negativity, rumors, crazy stories. But I'm telling you, when you open up those old newspapers back in the day, there's still drama, sensational stories, but they're just much more articulate and well written.
Much more articulate.
When you dive in those old newspapers, just in general, what are your thoughts?
Looking at old newspapers is maybe my favorite thing in the world. So my daughter Addison is 10, and one of her favorite things is we'll go into the microfilm room at the library, and she'll pick an old newspaper. Sometimes it'll be like from 100 years ago today, or sometimes it's just at random. And we'll just look through it and see what we see. And one of the chapters in this book is about the Hungarian history of South Bend.
I haven't read that one yet.
That chapter came about because of a random microfilm that she pulled.
Really?
And we were looking through it, and there was a little story that I was like, whoa, hang on a second. Let's read this. And then I started taking notes and dove into that and found a whole chapter out of it.
South Bend, Indiana, 1935. And you mentioned in the chapter, you said if you opened up the newspaper, they'd be reading about Dillinger, Capone, the Lindbergh baby. But January 10th, 1935 at Colfax in Michigan. To our listeners, the Morris is right nearby, but the restaurant, the Fatbird restaurant, is there right now. What happened one early morning, 3:48 a.m. to be exact? What happened that kind of rocked the city?
So the details that we actually know are about 3:48 a.m. There's a car that pulls up with presumably a driver and a guy jumps out of it, runs into the Palais Royale, or actually the Palace Cafe specifically. Drops some bombs and leaves.
Wild.
And the only quote that we have is that the bombs explode, and it's an enormous explosion that's felt as far away as Mishawaka.
Wow.
There's a night watchman working somewhere in Mishawaka who reports that it felt like an earthquake in Mishawaka.
Wow.
So there were 3 devices. They all blew up. The bomber yells, "Woo, that was a honey." Just a very 1935 thing to say.
See?
Yep,
yeah,
absolutely. And they leave, and they escape, and they do not get caught. The bomber never gets caught, and so
that's wild.
The investigation begins.
And before we dive in just to the whole investigation, which gets much more little dramatic, as you could tell, just the immediate aftermath. You had written a dozen businesses had their windows shattered. I mean, close by, this Dixie frock shop was decimated. I mean, looters and souvenir hunters snatched things. I mean, merchandise in every direction, you said, on Michigan and Colfax. And the damage was $150,000, which is over $3 million today. Could you imagine if something like that happened now with all these cell phones and stuff and everything?
I mean, what we're talking about is, I mean, this doesn't quite meet the threshold of a terrorist attack.
Correct.
Because it wasn't, terror motivated. But, I mean, if bombs went off downtown, it would be everything.
Be headline news across the country, really. Mm-hmm. I mean, wow, that's crazy. But then right off the bat, you had written at the same time that the actual authorities were investigating, there were amateur sleuths, and there were investigative journalists were surmising what they thought happened. And I could just imagine today, same thing on Facebook, comments, this and that.
Oh yeah, it's not different. Yeah, just a different medium. 90
years ago, but the same thing. All right. Now, you, speaking of the investigation, I love this. You wrote, the whole affair would prove to be a difficult investigation, and not because they didn't have any suspects. It was because they had too many.
Yeah.
And the first one you wrote about was a rowdy group of musicians?
Yeah. So the Palace Cafe had live music.
Okay.
And the owner was a guy named James Stassinos. And he was hiring non-union musicians. So the union was protesting. The union musicians were protesting the Palace Cafe.
Right.
That night, before the bombs go off, there's rowdy unionist musicians in front of the cafe picketing. And you also got to understand, like, about the 30s, like, sometimes militant unionists bombed things.
Absolutely.
Like, that was not a
violence.
thing that
it was violence.
Didn't happen. Yeah. Yes. I mean, it happened at the LA Times. People died.
Wow.
So there were headlines in the paper, national headlines about union activists blowing up buildings. So that's the first thing that people start whispering about is we saw these angry people. We saw angry people with signs yelling at the guy outside the building.
What, 5 hours or 3 hours before it exploded?
Yeah. So that's one of the first leads that they have.
That's something else. And you're exactly right. We think unions now, I mean, they've been so watered down over the years, but at that time it was baseball bats, picket lines, and it was serious.
Yeah. And it went both ways, obviously, because the people breaking up the unions would bomb things and shoot you. And
unbelievable. Oh, and then another theory that came about, that you mentioned, that it didn't come from the underbelly of the Chicago streets or hoodlum informant, that it came from the accountants. That they had accountants had dug up some dirt on how they thought the owner and business partners or something like that.
Yeah, so they dug into the finances of the business. So this is just people with whatever the 1935 version of Excel spreadsheets was. And they found out that there were these two business partners, Stassinos and Zaguras, and they had an ugly falling out.
Okay.
So Stassinos stayed in charge of the restaurant, but this other guy was mad and he was angry, and he had been vocal about how angry he was at feeling like he'd been forced out of ownership of his restaurant. So now Zaguris is also a subject because he's angry at the current management of his old restaurant.
That's nuts, man. And again, folks, 1935, we don't have these cell phones out. We don't have cameras. We don't have everything being captured. We don't have surveillance. We don't have any of that. Heck, TV isn't even hardly around.
Yeah, we have theories.
Yeah, theories. Yeah. That's it. Oh, then you had mentioned the owner, James Stassinos. That's how you pronounce it, I'd say.
Yep.
He had deep connections in Chicago, but then then all the attention went to him.
Yeah, so the next guy they start investigating is Stassinos, the current owner, and they find out that he is deeply, deeply, deeply in debt. That the restaurant is not being profitable for him.
Right.
But he does have a sizable bomb insurance policy, like specific to bombing. That was a policy you could get, Yeah. You could bundle your home, auto, and bombing, all by calling the 1935 version of Jake from State Farm. And so now they're looking at him. So we've got three real suspects: angry musicians, a jilted former owner, and a current owner who's completely underwater and just made sure to take out bomb insurance. And eventually the feds come in, and the investigation really starts to focus in on James Stassinos, the current owner of the establishment.
Okay.
There are rumors that he's got ties to the Chicago mob. There's a real shady character who claims that he saw Stassinos meeting with other real shady characters.
Okay.
And when it goes to trial, it's Stassinos who's on the stand.
Right.
The union musicians and his former business partner are cleared via alibi or whatever.
Right.
And now they're trying to prosecute Stassinos.
Didn't they say the bomb also was stereotypical or typical of a Chicago style bomb?
Yeah. Don't you want to know what that means?
Probably tons of bombings in Chicago. It's similar,
Yeah.
I mean, but that was interesting there too. It's just still all wild. South Bend, Indiana, right on Michigan and Colfax. All this going on. You mentioned the trial. We talk about drama and big trials now in different cities. It seems as if this was pretty dramatic too.
Well, of course.
The trial?
Of course it was.
100 witnesses?
100 witnesses.
Unbelievable.
So much testimony, so many days. I hate to say that it was like South Bend's version of the OJ trial, but there are some similarities in that it was hard for them to find a jury because everyone who was, a candidate to be on the jury had already heard so much from the newspaper, from their neighbors. So by the time they finally get a jury and go to trial, it turns into this high drama fiasco.
Yeah.
It's the lead of the newspaper every single day. Who testified?
Crazy.
What did they say? What do the experts think is going to happen? The newspaper comes out and people are waiting, with bated breath to open this thing to see what happened in the Stassinos trial today.
That's wild. It's again, 90 years later, we have the same stuff going on today. Sensationalized but this is dead serious, man. I mean, people could have died. This is right in the heart of our city. At the time, Michigan Street wasn't the Michigan Street we know now. Michigan Street was the 2 mile long of nothing but retail and theaters, and it was a legit jumping place. Wow. The outcome of the trial, the jury only took 3 hours to deliberate.
The jury only took 3 hours to deliberate.
After 100 witnesses?
After all of that. So the prosecution just kept pulling people who couldn't quite prove that Stassinos was connected.
Okay.
They'd say, they'd have a shady guy say, hey, I saw him with some other shady guys.
Yeah.
And then the defense would be like, this guy's been in jail for 10 years.
Yes.
8 times. So maybe we shouldn't trust everything that he just says. And then the defense also said, why didn't they look into the musicians? That seems more likely. So what they were doing is just planting a reasonable doubt.
Absolutely.
There was no defense. I mean, the guy wasn't at the scene. We know he didn't do the bombing. Someone hired bombers. And in order to make him guilty, it's not enough to say he had bomb insurance. He benefited from it.
You have to all circumstantial.
You have to prove that he hired these people, and they couldn't do it.
And the defense you had written had an answer for everything.
For everything. Every witness that they brought up was troublesome.
Yeah.
Every theory that they provided was circumstantial, and in the end, Stassinos gets off
in 3 hours.
In 3 hours. Personally shakes the hand of each juror and thanks them after the trial is over, which I don't know if that's a thing. It doesn't feel like that should be a thing.
Probably not, but hey.
It was.
Hey, he did. Was the trial, did it get, I don't remember reading it or not, was it in St. Joe County or did it get moved?
No, it was here.
So it would have been at the the courthouse now. The 1920-something courthouse.
Yeah, at the courthouse. So you can imagine what a big news story this is.
2 blocks.
Yeah.
2 blocks from the bombing.
Yeah. So every day in newspapers across the country, like, they're reporting on national news.
Yep.
And all the national news gets pushed to the second page in South
Bend
because of this story. The better part of 6-9 months.
Wow. It was a big deal. So it would be today, it would be something where it's all on our TV, it's all on our phones. WNDU, WSBT, South Bend Tribune. Wow, that's a big deal. But the courtroom drama wasn't it, because he sued the insurance company to get paid that bomb insurance money, right?
He did. So the insurance company didn't want to pay out.
Right.
And they looked for every excuse not to pay out, which is what insurance companies did at the time, and still do sometimes today, I suppose. So they tried not to pay out. They were really hoping, obviously, for a guilty verdict,
right?
Because then they wouldn't have to pay out.
Automatic, right?
But they didn't get it. They dragged their feet. So he had to take the insurance company to court in order to get his payout. And then once he finally got the payout, he decided to open another restaurant.
Hold on. The name of it is classic. Is it the Nip and Sip?
It's the Nip and Sip.
Yes.
You probably don't have memories of going there.
No, I don't.
It had some false starts. It opened. It was supposed to be like a pub. He had a lot of trouble getting a liquor license because of his reputation as, like,
understandable,
a quasi mobster / bomber guy
with ties to Chicago.
And so there was very little in the government to stop him from opening a restaurant. I mean, he could open an establishment, but one thing they could control is whether or not he got a liquor license.
The Nip and Sip.
So the Nip and Sip opened without a liquor license. He may have served some liquor without a liquor license. Right. The restaurant failed, and he went to Florida.
Moved to Florida. I love that. The name, the Nip and Sip. So what do you think happened? Have you came to a conclusion, or are you just going to leave it out there?
When I started to write this chapter, I had it in my head, like, I'm going to put my detective hat on.
Okay.
And I'm going to solve this thing.
Okay. Yeah. With all the volumes of newspapers and articles and this and that. Right.
So I didn't solve it. I did not. But I think the most likely thing for me is that Stassinos was guilty.
Yeah.
And if his great grandchildren are out there listening to this, like, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're sorry, great grandchildren, but I agree.
But it really feels like it.
Yeah.
The union musician theory doesn't hold any water because the cafe employed non-union musicians, but the theater was right there, which is where they all performed.
That was their moneymaker.
So they would never bomb their moneymaker.
Yep.
I don't know what the old owner stood to gain from bombing it, and his alibi was the most airtight. And again, like, I'm not from 1935.
Right.
So I don't know how common it was for people to say things to their insurance agent like, make sure I get a bombing policy.
Right.
That feels weird.
Yes. That feels mighty weird.
I can tell you that the police department still considers the case to be open and unsolved.
Really? Wow, that's neat. Yeah, well, it is. It's never been solved, and it will never be solved, and it will always be open. That's nuts. I did not dive deep into the newspapers with this one, but I did just a little bit off the top. I think I read this in the newspaper that they were playing in the aftermath of that, pre-TV, pre-everything, but they could still make film. They were playing the newsreel of the aftermath at their Granada. Like they were advertising that.
Yeah, you could come see the newsreel of someone walking up and down the street with like looters just picking up stuff.
God,
and
I want to see that. I wonder where I can get my hands on that. Probably impossible, but probably way gone.
How would you like to be one of the looters, though? You know, like some building just blew up and you snatched a watch, and now there's a movie of you stealing a watch.
That's a good point. I guess that's the pre us taking cell phones out and getting, getting recorded now and getting caught.
So the other businesses, the tangential businesses, they all got their insurance payouts. So there was no incentive for them to like track down the people who picked up the detritus from the road because they got paid for their lost merchandise.
Regardless. Right,
so looting, I guess, was okay at that point. And besides, they had bigger fish to fry. You know, they weren't so worried with who picked up something off of the street. They wanted to know who dropped the bomb.
Who bombed it, And for the life of me, I can't think of another instance like that I've researched or seen or heard of in our city. I can't think of another like bombing.
No, I mean, obviously there have been, terrible fires.
Oh God, there's been fires, there's been fights and murders but robberies, but a bombing. That's just wild. And that building, I mean, that's a very historic building to our downtown. I mean, that's one of the anchors of our downtown right there. The palace, the Palais Royale, the palace, the Morris. I mean, the Morris could have been heavily damaged. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah. Whoever did it didn't want to hurt anyone.
Because of the 3 a.m. thing?
Went off at 3:48 in the morning. So it was just to destroy
the physical
proper place.
Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. An extra special thanks to Aaron Helman for joining us and sharing the story behind the bombing at the Palace Theater. People, head to his website in our show notes, aaronhelman.com, and check out his books. I promise you won't be disappointed. And while you're on the interweb, be sure to follow Round the Bend Now and Then on all of our socials and check out the new YouTube channel for a few cool new videos. Join us again next time and learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.